Good evening and welcome to Manitoba Moments. We're in the MTS Centre, the same spot where the old Eaton's building used to stand. If it were still here today, it would be celebrating its 100th year. Now, a lot of famous Manitobans got their start at Eaton's, including our former Premier Gary Filmon and our former Winnipeg Mayors Bill Norrie and Susan Thompson. Tonight, we take a look back at the big store and the Manitobans who worked at Eaton's and still consider it home. It was the spring of 1904. The Timothy Eaton store in Toronto was thriving, not just in Ontario, but into the West because of its mail-order business. Russ Gorlick has compiled the long and colorful history of Eaton's in his book, A Store Like No Other.
As Eaton's was getting more and more orders from Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Alberta, they decided that maybe they should open something in Manitoba.
Winnipeg was an obvious choice. It was dubbed the Chicago of the North because of how quickly it was growing. In 1871, it boasted a meager population of 241, but by 1904, it had skyrocketed to 67,000. John Craig Eaton, son of the great retail guru Timothy Eaton, had the daunting task of choosing the Winnipeg store's new location.
At the time, the main business area of Winnipeg was Main Street, north and south of Portage. There was very little on Portage Avenue. But John realized that there was an opportunity to buy land at a much more reasonable price. And they quietly bought up a whole parcel of land on Portage between Hargrave and Donald.
It was a risk, but one that paid off. Timothy Eaton was a forward thinker who embraced new technology. He pioneered electric lights, passenger elevators, and phones in his store. In the end, Eaton's in downtown Winnipeg would take 1 year to build, have 5 stories with room to add more, and exceed 5.5 acres. It literally covered the entire block from Hargrave to Donald and back to Graham. On July 15th, 1905, people were given a sneak peek. Nothing was being sold, but an estimated 20 to 25,000 people walked through Eaton's doors.
2 days later, the 17th of July, when it opened, and that's exactly 100 years ago now, they estimated 50,000 people went through the doors of that store, which is pretty amazing when you consider that Winnipeg's population at the time was something like 78,000. It was successful from day one.
Almost immediately, the number of employees needed to be doubled, and the love affair with the big store began.
My dad was Eaton's. There's nobody in the whole world but Eaton's.
I remember when I was a little girl, we used to order stuff. It was first thing, catalog, everything from Eaton's, you know. Eaton's was a big thing.
The catalog business continued to flourish. By the 1920s, there were 3 mail-order buildings. People continued to call the catalogs the Farmer's Bible. It was rural Manitobans' link to the big city. Merchandise was couriered across Manitoba via horse and buggy. By 1933, there were 150 horses, going through more than 4,000 horseshoes a year. They ran their routes until February 1939, when delivery trucks took over. During the Second World War, gas rationing brought the horses back once again.
They were short of people, and they said, "Can you help us out?" So I thought, gee, I don't know, I'm going to school, and I thought, yeah, I think I'll help you out, but just on a what do you call, on a temporary basis, because I'm going back to school in September. And that was 21st of April, 1947, and ended up 43 and a half years later.
The horses were a much-loved reminder of the famous retail giant and are often a source of fond and humorous memories for former employees like Steve Kiz.
There's one traffic light on my route on Jubilee and Pembina Highway, and he knew if it was a red light, you come to a stop. And as soon as it turned green, away he went. But the amber light kind of confused him.
But with a new store, people could now come in, see and touch merchandise, or try on clothes. Eaton's became the place to shop and eventually dine. The Eaton's famous grill room opened in 1911, serving up a number of tempting dishes and lighter fare, including the infamous cheese and asparagus rolls. Later, the Winnipeg store would win the distinction of having the longest meat counter in North America at 220 feet, and a bakery that operated at one point for 22 hours a day.
there's figures that suggest that it might have been the most successful department store in North America or even the world.
When Manitoba Moments returns,
You couldn't imagine what a company it was unless you worked for them.
Eaton's star continues to rise, and with it, a sense of loyalty and admiration grows among its employees, or Eatonians, as they would later be known. By the time the 1940s rolled around, Eaton's had grown and become the premier place to shop in Winnipeg.
I guess the one thing that really struck me, if you have to sort of find a single word to describe the relationship between Eaton's and the people of Winnipeg and of the province, the word would be loyalty.
When you were young, your parents were either an Eaton shopper or a Bay shopper.
So anyway, we marched down the bay and got our kitten sweaters at the bay and came home, and I walked in the house with a bay bag. My dad just about went through the roof.
You can't.
They don't have any better, oh, he was furious. So if I ever bought anything anywhere else, I'd go back to work, put it in an Eaton bag, and take it home.
For people like Joan Collins, working at the big store became a family tradition.
My dad worked in the catalog building, and my mom worked in the dispensary in drugs. And one of his mutual friends introduced them, and that's how they met.
Eaton's was simply an extension of her family.
And it was almost like home to me, because when Dad worked in the catalog, when Mom took me downtown, she would take me over, and the doorman would recognize us, and he'd phone Dad, because you couldn't go into the building. And he'd come down and get us, and I would march up there with him. And Dad's boss said to me, "Now, Joan, when you finish school," he says, "you come and see me, and you'll get a job in Eaton's." So that I did. That's where I went, and I was never sorry.
Joan started at Eaton's in 1946 at just 16 years old. Years later, she would meet and marry her husband Ron through Eaton's.
We sort of met on the baseball field. She worked in the paint department, and I worked in the drapery department on the 4th floor in the mail order.
In fact, a lot of couples met through activities sponsored by Eaton's, like baseball teams or bowling.
I'd seen him, because you go to the coffee shop.
She had her eye out for me, so there you go.
Oh, boy. Yeah, that stunned me.
Ron Collins says what made Eaton's so much like family was the manner in which it treated its employees, helping out in ways that only a parent or relative would do.
We were looking at houses. We saw one in Windsor Park. I think we had about $2,000. Money was tight in them days. And somehow the management of the store, I don't know if it was her manager or my manager, got a hold of it. And we got called into the employment office one morning, the both of us. And I think it was Bobby Laidlaw was his name. He's the chap. And he said, "I understand that you're short $1,000 on a down payment for a house. We needed $3,000. We didn't have it. So he said, we're going to give you $500 each. We're going to take it out of your pay, and you're not going to pay any interest on it." So that was...
We never even signed a piece of paper.
No, nothing.
We never signed anything.
At one time, Eaton's had its own hospital, and if an Eatonian was sick at home, the store would send a nurse to their house. Eaton's benefits were the envy of the town, but eventually there would be 2 attempts to unionize Eaton's, once in 1948, then in the early 80s. Both attempts would fail.
I think everyone else was unionized, and so they asked, how come Eaton's wasn't unionized? And I said, well, really, why would we be? Because, and then when I started to tell them our benefits, they just couldn't believe it.
John Minella started working at Eaton's in 1957. He never forgets one particularly tough year when his father passed away. He'd only been working with the company for 7 or 8 months.
They asked me if financially if we were okay in terms of the funeral, if we needed any cars or anything like that. And I says, no, I says, everything is okay. We're okay. We don't need anything, He says, well, we'll send a couple of limousines over anyway to the church. So if anybody wants to go to the cemetery, they can use the limousines. These things you don't forget. And as a result, I stayed all that time.
And in times of hardship, Eaton's went beyond other companies of the day, like the time when a huge winter storm hit in 1966 and stranded more than 1,400 people at the store.
We kept them overnight and we fed them all for nothing. And we had women were sleeping up in the furniture department on the 7th floor on the Chesterfields mat, and we made all the men sleep on the carpets on the 6th floor so they wouldn't get mixed up with the ladies.
But what stands out most for Etonians was how they were treated when the Second World War broke out. Hundreds of employees chose to go and fight, leaving their jobs and their families behind.
If you were married, they made up the difference in the salary you were getting at Eaton's and what you got in the military. Like in those days, $1.30 a day or so would be when you joined up.
Upon their return, former soldiers would get their old jobs back or move into other positions. And for those who were killed, their names were bronzed in these war memorials that still exist today. When Manitoba Moments returns, Eaton's heads into hard times of its own, and things start to unravel for the retail giant. Eaton's had become a fixture across the country, and especially in Winnipeg's downtown area.
When I started, it was heyday. It was a thriving organization. It had just the business and the market share and everything in Winnipeg was huge.
Deborah Jonason Young started working at Eaton's during the 70s when she was just 17 years old.
Winnipeg downtown store, to work in that store was more exciting than anything else that could have happened in Winnipeg at that point in time.
Eaton's, in many ways, was in the right place at the right time in its era. They offered sales that really appealed to people, that were genuine bargains. They offered good quality merchandise at reasonable prices.
But really, by the 1960s, things were starting to change at Eaton's. That year, the company would suffer $40 million in losses. The catalog business was part of those losses.
What happened in Winnipeg was really a kind of microcosm of what was happening across the country.
In 1960, there were 101 trucks delivering more than 14,000 parcels a day. By 1987, the number of parcel trucks would drop to just 12, making 2 deliveries a week. The catalog was canceled in 1976. Around 1,600 people lost their jobs, and the one thing that drew customers to Eaton's would eventually be part of its demise.
The Eaton Guarantee, where people knew that if goods were not absolutely satisfactory, their money would be refunded.
That included shipping costs both ways. That courtesy was an expensive one. Russ Gorluck says the heyday of Eaton's was on its way out.
It was such an integral part of our lifestyle, but that changed. I mean, you could make that statement up till about the 60s and even the 70s, but I mean, downtown itself, downtown Portage Avenue declined as the malls opened, and I think the opening of Polo Park was very significant for that reason.
I think you could see the writing on the wall then.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody talked about it, and it was a sad time.
It was sad.
It was getting tough. It's like Ron was saying, the writing was on the wall. And I don't think that the young Eaton boys, George and Thor, were that interested in the retailing. They had their other interests.
Many felt that some of the remaining Eaton descendants, like Fred, John Craig Jr., and George, were at the root of the company's problems.
I think it's easy to blame them. They're kind of the lightning rods, and I don't think that they shared or that they demonstrated the enthusiasm for the business that their grandfather or father. There were a lot of factors that I don't think anybody could have anticipated.
Others felt the company just lost sight of the most important factor, the customer.
Our customer was always the low to middle class customer. They were interested in going to the middle to high class customer. Sure, it's fine to have the high class stuff, but don't emphasize it when you're trying to look at Walmart. You know, they're not looking at but look how many people that drive up in the Rolls Royces and the Jags to go and shop at Walmart.
One of the more painful moments of the decline was what it meant for Etonians. For more than 43 years, people like Steve Kiz were valued and appreciated. But management, along with the store, was also changing.
They gave me a deal, you know, and they said they'd pay me till I'm 65, and they gave me a year's severance pay, and I thought, I can't believe this, you know. So I asked them to repeat that, and they said, yeah, that's what it is. So I said, well, I quit right now. Oh, you can't quit right now. No, that's it. And I just walked out the door.
By February 1997, Eaton's was holding off bankruptcy, deciding to restructure. At the time, company officials admitted 40 of the chain's 87 stores were in trouble, but that no store closures would take place until after Christmas. Attempts to get Eaton's out of debt and sold to another company failed. In November of 1999, 13,000 employees were told they would lose their jobs and the liquidation process would begin.
We couldn't figure out what went wrong. We couldn't understand how somebody could be so great and then fade away.
Well, it was like losing a relative, you know, and you'd been there all your life practically, and it was a very sad thing for all of us. You know, we really felt badly about it. But I guess times had changed too much, and they didn't change fast enough.
It's sick to my stomach the way I feel about it. You know, I love this place. I wish it could go on. I'm still hoping, deep down, I'm hoping there's going to be an 11th and 59-minute hour savior. But the past few days I've come to terms with it.
But a savior did appear. Sears Canada bought some Eaton stores that same year and converted them into high-end retailers, including here in Winnipeg. But even changing the Big E to a little one couldn't change its fortunes. Some Etonians would say it was repeating the same mistake Eaton's made years earlier, alienating its core and often older shoppers. Customers must have agreed. 3 years later, the store would close and change over to a Sears or a Bay store.
You lost this incredible history, this 27, for me it was 27 years of a life built while working in the Eaton company. So it's part of who I am, and it's part of where I am today.
When Manitoba Moments returns, former employees say goodbye to a legend. By the late 80s, the writing may very well have been on the wall, as some Etonians put it. The light was dimming for the giant on the Canadian retail stage.
I'd never written a book. I had no idea if anybody would be willing to even, to publish it. But I knew after a few months that the story was worth telling, and that so many people, so many of the Etonians had helped me so much that it had to be somehow printed, even if I just ran it off on a photocopier and gave copies to them.
Even towards the end, Etonians' loyalty to the company never wavered. In 1989, Jim Thompson and Reg Hart started a club for employees.
Jimmy said, do you have a list of retired employees? And I said, yes. And he says, how many? And I said, around 1,500. And he said, okay. And then it went from there.
About 500 members of the club try to meet once or twice a month for coffee or get-togethers to reminisce. In the end, it was the Etonians who fought hard to keep the Timothy Eaton statue here in Winnipeg. The 3,200-pound statue had sat in the same spot for 71 years.
It was a meeting place. You either met at the statue or you met under the cloth. It depended who you were going to meet.
It was saved largely because of the Etonians' long-standing passion, loyalty, and love of a company that meant so much to so many for nearly a century.
Eaton's lives with the retirement club. And sure, you can look back and say, okay, fine, dandy, what could have been done to save the store and that, but really, what is what it was.
But the only thing the next generation of Winnipeggers will know of Eaton's now stands in the MTS Centre in plaques, a statue, and memorabilia. And for some Etonians, that's all right.
At that time, I thought, hey, if it goes, anything they put in here is not ever going to be any good. But I think I've been proven wrong with that, with the MTS. I mean, that's a fabulous building.
There was much criticism and an outcry when City Hall didn't designate the building an historical site.
If you tear down Eaton's, I'm going to move away, and I'm not going to come back.
The Save the Eatons Building Coalition sprung up to try and stop the demolition of the building. But some Etonians had a different view of it all.
And the building, the way it was constructed, couldn't have been converted. See, there was all wooden beams in it, and all the floors, great big 18-inch beams, and then there was wooden slats on top of that, and it would never pass the fire codes.
When Eaton's built the store in 1905, it was a tribute to the future. It was a company that said, look at the opportunity. I think, personally, Timothy E. would have been mortified to see a building that was dedicated to the past taking up space.
Eventually, the club is going to go. Now, because we don't go on forever, like Manitoba history, it'll be there in the history, just like the old City Hall building. Beautiful building that they ripped down, but we still got pictures of it and everything like that. So I think it won't be forgotten.
The Winnipeg Etonians still meet today and will continue to do so until they fade away. At least that's how Ron Collins puts it. Some say Winnipeg's downtown is making a comeback, and even though Eaton's won't be there for that revitalization, some say they're holding on to the memories of the great retail giant that once stood so tall on Portage Avenue. Thank you for joining us for Manitoba Moments. I'm Eleanor Koopsamy. Have a good night.